Sweetheart, that's not a uniform. That's a costume from a war nobody remembers. The words cut through the equipment bay like a blade scraping metal. The compressor in the corner wheezed on and off, chasing air through hoses that had outlived 3 different maintenance contracts. Somewhere behind it, a socket wrench clattered against a concrete floor, and nobody bothered to pick it up right away because everyone's attention had already swung toward the workbench near the far wall. 22 soldiers and contractors filled the bay that morning, half of them turning to see who Major Wade Kessler had decided to embarrass this time. It was a Tuesday. It was supposed to be a routine equipment check before the joint readiness exercise kicked off. Kessler had a way of turning routine into theater. He wore his dress uniform like a costume of his own, 4 rows of ribbons stacked with careful precision, oak leaves polished to a mirror shine, arms crossed like he owned not just the exercise, but the entire training command underneath it. Outside, a formation somewhere across the lot called cadence. Boots hitting gravel in a rhythm that carried faintly through the bay's open roll door, and the smell of gun oil and cold concrete hung over everything the way it does in buildings that have processed the same routines for decades. He stepped closer to the bench. His shadow fell across the workspace, swallowing the rifle optic she'd been calibrating in darkness. And he let it sit there a beat too long before he spoke again. "I mean it," he said, loud enough for the back row to hear. "Where did you even get that thing? Army surplus? Estate sale? Somebody's grandfather's attic?" A few people near the parts counter chuckled, and Kessler fed on it the way he fed on everything, tilting his head like he was studying an exhibit instead of a person. "Seriously, somebody should tell you they don't issue that pattern anymore. Whole units probably been shut down since before you were old enough to drive." Alina Cross was 34, small enough that men like Kessler mistook her size for the whole of her, with forearms corded in the kind of muscle that doesn't come from a gym membership. Her uniform carried no rank, no bars, no oak leaves, nothing but a name tape reading Cross and a single patch on her left sleeve, faded almost to gray from wear that had nothing to do with a costume shop. She didn't look up. Her hands kept moving, adjusting the scope's turret with the exact unhurried precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times in places with far worse lighting than a training bay at 0900 on a Tuesday. She didn't flinch. She didn't answer right away. The stillness in her unsettled the room more than any comeback could have, and Kessler, who fed on reactions the way other men fed on coffee, didn't know what to do with a woman who wasn't afraid of him. "Older than your career, sir. Try again." 7 words. Then she went back to the scope. Somebody near the tool crib laughed, quick and nervous, the kind of laugh that invites everyone else to join in before they've decided whether it's actually funny. A few did. Kessler grinned at the sound, encouraged, and leaned down toward her bench like he was inspecting a museum piece behind glass. "This patch," he said, tapping the faded insignia on her shoulder with 2 fingers, "isn't even current. You do know that, right? Whatever unit this was supposed to be, it's not real anymore. Nice bit of theater, though, really. Commit to the bit." She said nothing. She tightened a screw a quarter turn and set the tool down with a small, definite click, the kind of sound that ends a conversation whether the other person agrees to end it or not. "Nothing to say?" Kessler pressed. "Or are you just here to hand out coffee to the people doing real work?" In the doorway, watching without watching, stood Command Sergeant Major Earl Tanner. 62 years old. 34 years in uniform. Most of them spent teaching young officers the difference between authority and command, a distinction Kessler had never once bothered to learn. Tanner noticed the patch, the way she hadn't tried to hide it, the way her hand had drifted to it once, briefly. like checking a wound to make sure it had closed. His jaw tightened. His pen stopped moving over the clipboard he carried everywhere he went, out of habit more than necessity. He said nothing. He would say nothing for a long time yet. Camp Ridgeline had pulled in contractors from 4 different commands for the joint readiness exercise that week, and Alina Cross was supposed to be one of the quiet ones, an optics and night vision certification specialist on paper, brought in to sign off on equipment before live fire began. Nobody had questioned the paperwork. Nobody ever did, which was, in its own way, exactly the point of paperwork like hers. At 0930 formation, 43 people stood in loose ranks across the gravel lot outside the bay. Instructors with clipboards, maintenance crew still wiping grease off their hands, a scattering of junior officers pretending not to be curious. Kessler found a reason to walk the line twice, and both times he slowed near Cross long enough to let the silence stretch. "Everybody get a good look," he said, loud enough to carry. "This is what happens when somebody's uncle pulls a favor to get a relative a government contract." A ripple of laughter went through the formation. Not everyone, but enough of them. She didn't turn her head. She kept her eyes forward, spine straight, hands at her sides in a posture so exact it looked almost mechanical, and said nothing at all, which somehow needled him more than an answer would have. By noon, the story had already outgrown the bay. In the mess hall, someone called her the Antique, and the name stuck faster than any correction could have caught it. 2 young specialists at a nearby table tried it out loud as she walked past with her tray, snickering when she didn't react. One of them going so far as to salute her with an exaggerated flourish and call her General Fossil under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. She ate alone, at the end of a table nobody else chose, working through a tray of food that tasted like institutional efficiency rather than nourishment, listening to the room the way other people watch television, cataloging who deferred to whom, who flinched when Kessler raised his voice, where the real chain of command bent around the official one long before anyone had to say a word about it out loud. She noted which sergeants rolled their eyes when Kessler wasn't looking, and which ones laughed a half-second too late. The way people laugh when they're following a script instead of feeling something. She was doing intelligence work while appearing to be an isolated target, and nobody in that mess hall had the first idea. The afternoon brought new indignities, each one smaller than the last, and somehow more grating for it. Someone photographed the patch on her sleeve without asking, and captioned it a relic in a group chat with 41 members. Someone else claimed, with total confidence and zero evidence, that she'd been caught impersonating personnel on a different base entirely. None of it was true. All of it spread anyway, the way rumors do on a base with more idle hands than urgent business, moving faster than any official channel could have carried it. The competence clues began stacking up, one at a time, each one noticed by exactly one man in the building. In the equipment shed, she'd entered the monthly authentication override in under 10 seconds, fingers moving across the keypad without hesitation. Most technicians needed 5 minutes and a phone call to remind them of the sequence, and half of those calls ended in a support ticket. The way she broke down the M110 sniper rifle, wrist angle, finger spacing, the particular economy of motion that wasted nothing. Tanner had only ever seen that exact grip taught at schools that didn't appear on any public roster. The kind of schools where the graduation photos never made it into a yearbook. When a full colonel walked through the bay unannounced later that afternoon, she addressed him correctly before he said a word, before his rank insignia was even visible past the angle of the doorway. Tanner clocked it. He didn't say anything. He wrote it down in his head instead of on the clipboard. Reaching for a torque wrench near the end of the day, her sleeve rode up once. The scar underneath wasn't surgical. It was jagged, the kind that comes from shrapnel. from being closer to an explosion than any manual recommends, the kind of scar that only ever gets one honest explanation and a dozen dishonest ones. Under pressure, her posture didn't approximate regulation. It was regulation. Exact. Drilled past conscious thought. The kind of stillness that only comes from years spent training your body not to give away what your mind is thinking. Not the posture of someone performing discipline. The posture of someone who no longer remembered how to stand any other way. Tanner's pen stopped at each one. He was building something in his head, quietly, detail by detail, and he wasn't ready to say what it was yet, not even to himself. Tanner had heard a name once, years earlier, at a retirement dinner nobody official would confirm existed. A program whispered about by men who'd earned the right to whisper about it. Something involving a small handful of operators who worked so far outside the normal chain that even acknowledging their existence violated somebody's clearance. He hadn't thought about it in years. He found himself thinking about it now, watching a woman with no rank insignia calibrate a scope like it was an extension of her own hand. There was a sixth clue, and it was the one that finally made him stop pretending he hadn't noticed the other 5. During the afternoon safety walk ahead of live fire, a young lieutenant had set up a target lane with a dogleg nobody had flagged. Cross said 4 words, "That lane's not safe," and kept walking before anyone could ask her to explain. Kessler waved it off in front of the range officer, called it an overcorrection from someone who didn't understand modern safety templates, and ordered the lane run as scheduled. Tanner pulled the diagram that night after hours, traced the fan of fire against the tree line by flashlight, and found the exact backstop failure she'd clocked from 30 yards away in under 4 seconds. He didn't report it up. He didn't need to. He just added it to the picture forming in his head, and the picture was getting harder to ignore. At 13:30, Kessler decided the joke needed an audience big enough to finish it properly. He called the whole unit to the range bleachers. 51 people this time. Instructors and trainees, and a scattering of contractors who'd wandered over out of curiosity, and had her brought up in front of all of them to demonstrate proficiency on a weapon system she'd supposedly certified that morning. "Since you're the expert," he said, loud enough for the back row, "show everybody how it's done, slowly, so we can all appreciate the theater." She didn't ask which weapon, because he hadn't specified one, and there were 4 laid out on the table. She picked up the one with the most obscure malfunction history, field stripped it in under 12 seconds without looking down once, reassembled it, and set it back on the table, facing the exact direction range protocol required. Nobody clapped. Nobody laughed either. Not this time. A range instructor near the front let out a low whistle he clearly hadn't meant to make audible, and Kessler's jaw worked like he was chewing on a word he'd decided not to say. "Anyone can memorize a party trick," he said finally, turning back to the crowd, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land the way his earlier ones had. The 51 people on those bleachers didn't laugh with him this time. A few of them exchanged glances instead. That was the first crack nobody would talk about until much later, the moment the chorus stopped laughing on command and started simply watching. Kessler didn't leave it at mockery. By 1400, he'd opened a formal security review, her credentials, her access badge, the paperwork that had cleared her onto Camp Ridgeline in the first place. He made a show of it, walking the request personally to the admin office instead of routing it through channels, making sure enough people saw him do it. She cooperated fully. She answered exactly what was asked, and nothing more. "What were you doing at the range at 0500? "Equipment diagnostics." "Why 0500? "Fewer variables, cleaner data." "And the patch?" "Issued, like everything else I'm wearing." "Issued by who?" "That's classified, sir. Everything with you is classified." "Most things worth asking about usually are. Who's your contracting officer?" Above your access, sir, that's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. Kessler laughed at that one, loud enough that two clerks in the outer office looked up from their desks. Under the questions, she controlled her breathing without anyone in the room noticing. 4 counts in. Hold 4. 4 counts out. Hold 4. It wasn't nerves. It was a rhythm she'd used in rooms far worse than a beige office with bad fluorescent lighting, and a major who thought a security review was a punishment instead of a paper trail. After the interview, Kessler confiscated her access badge in the middle of the admin office, holding it up for the two clerks to see like a trophy. Pending review, he announced. She doesn't go anywhere on this post without an escort. Tanner, who had walked in halfway through, said only, "That's a call for the provost marshal, sir. Not for you," and Kessler waved him off without looking at him. Cross said nothing. She held out her hand, palm up, waited for the badge to be logged out properly instead of simply pocketed, and walked out with an escort 2 steps behind her, spine straight, exactly the way she'd walked out of the equipment bay that morning. By 1600, the story had a name and a punchline, repeated across 3 different group chats she wasn't supposed to know existed, but did anyway, because knowing things nobody expected her to know was, in its own way, the entire job. The afternoon brings new indignities, and this one had layers. First the mockery, then the whispers, then the formal paperwork stapled on top of both like Kessler thought a signature could make an insult official. Who else has watched someone get underestimated by exactly the wrong person, right before that person found out exactly how wrong they'd been? Not aggressively. Just there. That was how Tanner would later describe the feeling that had settled over him by the end of that day. Not suspicion exactly, not yet certainty. Just a low, steady hum of recognition he couldn't quite name and didn't trust himself to say out loud. By 1800, Kessler escalated again. Detention, pending full identity verification. A windowless holding room in the administration building. Roughly 8 feet by 10, cinder block walls painted a color that had once been called eggshell and had long since given up on the name. A metal bench bolted to the floor, and a single window near the ceiling that showed nothing but a strip of graying sky. The room smelled like disinfectant, losing a slow argument with something older underneath it. Something that had been in the walls longer than the paint. A young private stood post outside the door, visibly uncomfortable with the assignment, shifting his weight every few minutes like the silence in the room was leaking out under the door and into the hallway. He offered her water once. She thanked him. He didn't know what to do with how calm she was, and eventually he stopped trying to figure it out and just stood there, listening to nothing happen on the other side of a door that felt heavier than it should have. This is the near-fail moment. The point where anyone watching from outside would assume she was finished, detained, out of options, out of allies, out of time. Except this was never really a story about a woman without options. It was a story about a woman who had been planning 3 moves ahead since before Kessler ever learned her name, and she was about to show him he'd been playing an entirely different game than the one he thought he understood. She sat on the bench. She checked her watch, the one nobody had thought to confiscate, because nobody ever did. Nobody ever thinks to take the watch. In 23 minutes, a check-in she'd missed on purpose would trigger an automatic flag at a desk 4 states away. The kind of flag that didn't wait for business hours. In 63 minutes, a protocol she'd set in motion 3 months earlier, long before she'd ever heard the name Camp Ridgeline, long before Kessler had ever heard hers. would activate without a single keystroke from her. In just under 2 hours, Major Wade Kessler was going to learn the difference between the authority he thought he had and the authority that actually existed above his head, whether he was ready for the lesson or not. None of the 3 timers required her to do anything further. That was the part she almost found funny, sitting on a bolted metal bench in a room that smelled like old disinfectant. The hardest work was already finished, months ago, quietly, by a version of herself nobody in this building had ever met. She breathed. 4 in, hold 4. 4 out, hold 4. And she waited, the way she'd waited before, in rooms that had given her far less reason to expect a good outcome. She thought briefly about a different room, years earlier, with worse walls and no window at all, where the waiting had meant something closer to survival than paperwork. This room, by comparison, was almost restful. She let herself notice that, filed it away, and kept counting minutes instead of feelings. Tanner found Kessler in the hallway outside the holding room a little after 1900. And for the first time all day, he spoke. "I'd think very carefully about what you do next, sir." Kessler laughed it off, the way he laughed off most things he didn't want to sit with. "You worried about the antique, Sergeant Major?" "I'm worried about you," Tanner said, and walked away before Kessler could answer with anything clever. He didn't need to repeat himself. Something in the way he'd said it stayed in the hallway after he'd gone. The kind of quiet that makes people start checking exits without quite knowing why. At 1936, the first vehicle arrived. Not standard transport. Command vehicles, 4 of them, moving with the unhurried purpose of people who already know exactly where they're going and don't need directions from anyone on base. A full bird colonel stepped out first, jaw set, eyes already scanning for someone specific. Then a 2-star general, moving fast for a man his age. Then 2 men in plain suits who didn't introduce themselves and didn't need to. Boots on gravel, 4 doors closing almost in unison, no wasted motion anywhere in the procession. Kessler watched from the window of the operations center, arms still crossed out of habit, and something in his face began coming apart before anyone said a single word. The colonel found Kessler first. "Where is she?" Not a question. Kessler started to explain the security review, the paperwork, the discrepancies he'd flagged, and the colonel cut him off before he finished the second sentence. "I didn't ask why. I asked where." They walked him to the holding room instead of asking him to lead them there, which Kessler didn't register as strange until much later. The general went in alone first. Nobody outside the door heard what was said, though the private who'd been standing post swore afterward that the general had said only 2 words before the door clicked, shut behind him, and that the 2 words had sounded less like a greeting and more like an apology. When he came back out, 90 seconds later, his expression had changed in a way none of the 11 officers now crowding the hallway could quite name. Something between relief and reverence. The look of a man confirming a rumor he'd hoped was true, and feared was true in equal measure. They didn't ask for her by name. They asked for the patch. Tanner brought it to them himself, the faded gray insignia carefully unpinned from a sleeve that had earned it in places that never appeared on any map. A black hourglass crossed by twin blades, stitched in thread gone the color of ash with age. Beneath it, in letters too small to read from across a room, a designation, Task Force Widow. Program Sunset. The general's hand actually shook when he took it. Not from fear, from memory. He turned it over once, the way a man checks a coin he already knows is real. The stitching along the hourglass had been done by hand, not machine, a detail that meant something to men who'd spent decades reading unit patches the way other people read ARSAMs. The edges had gone soft with wear, folded and refolded inside a pocket for years at a stretch. The kind of wear that only comes from a patch that travels, not one that sits in a display case. Only 3 people were ever authorized to wear this, he said, mostly to himself. Officially, all 3 are listed as killed in action. Nobody in that hallway old enough to have heard the name needed him to explain what that meant. The younger officers just watched the color drain out of faces that were supposed to outrank everyone in the building. The hallway detonated into silence, the kind of silence with weight to it, with texture, with its own sound underneath the quiet. Somebody's radio clipped static and nobody moved to fix it. A clipboard slid off a desk and hit the tile, and the clatter rang out like a gunshot in a room that had forgotten how to breathe. The fluorescent hum overhead, background noise all day, suddenly seemed unbearably loud. The only thing left standing in a silence that swallowed everything else. It was the kind of silence that makes people start checking exits. The 2-star general saluted first, slow, deliberate, the crisp, exact angle of a gesture that meant something beyond regulation. Then the colonel, half a beat behind him. Then the 2 men in plain suits, who didn't wear uniforms, but came to attention anyway, the way men do when a room tells them to without a single word being spoken. Then, one after another, every officer standing in that hallway came to attention, until all 11 of them stood rigid in a corridor that 10 minutes earlier had held nothing but a woman in a holding cell and a man convinced he'd caught an imposter. Word traveled fast. By the time the holding room door finally opened, the 22 people who had laughed in the equipment bay that morning were standing along the corridor too, pressed in by the doorway, by the stairwell, by whatever gap they could find. They had laughed first, that morning. Then they had gone silent, sometime around 1800. Now they stood, without anyone ordering them to, and the sound that had started as laughter 8 hours earlier had traveled, beat by beat, all the way to silence, and now to something closer to reverence. The 2 specialists who'd called her General Fossil in the mess hall stood near the back of the crowd, not laughing now, not saying anything at all. One of them staring at the floor like the tile might offer an explanation for how badly he'd misjudged the morning. The range instructor who'd whistled at the bleachers just nodded slowly to himself, like a man confirming something he'd already half suspected. Every person in this building, myself included, answers to Commander Cross's authority, the general said, and the words landed harder than any shout could have. She has been listed dead on paper for 6 years. I'd suggest all of you forget you ever saw otherwise. Kessler didn't salute last. He didn't salute at all. He stood very still while his face cycled through surprise, then denial. Then something that looked disturbingly close to genuine fear. "Sir, I had no way of knowing," he started, and the general cut him off without raising his voice, which somehow made it worse than shouting would have. "You weren't supposed to know. That was the entire point of the program. What you were supposed to do, Major, was extend a stranger in a uniform the basic courtesy you'd extend anyone else on this post. You failed at the one part of this that didn't require clearance." Kessler had nothing to say to that. Not theatrical. Quiet. Worse than any speech he could have given, and everyone watching understood that the quiet was the whole point. His reckoning, when it came, was institutional rather than dramatic. Over the following weeks, a formal investigation into the unauthorized security review he'd initiated, a transfer that read like an ending on paper, charges that would never make a local newspaper. Tanner testified once, briefly, in a closed room, with no cameras and no audience. A strange, quiet ending for a man who'd only ever performed for a crowd. No shouting. No cameras, just signatures in a plain office, closing a door he hadn't known he'd opened the moment he decided a faded patch was worth mocking in front of 22 witnesses. Before the general left Camp Ridgeline that night, he pulled Tanner aside in the parking lot, away from the remaining crowd. "You knew," he said. "Not an accusation." Tanner shook his head. "I suspected," he said. "Same thing, some days." The general almost smiled at that, the first easy expression on his face since the vehicles had arrived. 34 years, and you still catch what a security review missed. "Don't retire yet, Sergeant Major." Tanner said he'd think about it, though both men understood he had no intention of retiring anytime soon. Elena didn't celebrate any of it. By the time the paperwork on Kessler's transfer was finalized, she was already 3 states away, working a different problem entirely, because the mission had never actually paused, no matter how loudly a training exercise on Camp Ridgeline had insisted otherwise. They mocked her old uniform. They forgot the only people allowed to wear that patch were supposed to already be dead. 3 weeks later, she sat on the tailgate of a truck at the edge of a different installation, watching the sky bruise orange and violet as evening settled in over the tree line. Her watch read 1943. Somewhere behind her, an exercise she'd technically failed to attend was wrapping up without her, and nobody there would ever fully understand what they'd almost destroyed with a joke about an old uniform in a Tuesday morning equipment bay. Tanner had sent one message before she shipped out. 3 words. Nothing more. "Good hunting, Commander." She hadn't answered. She didn't need to. Some things get said better by staying quiet, and he understood that better than most men his age still in uniform. Justice isn't loud, it's patient. She'd built that list over 6 years of being officially dead, adding a name every time one of her people didn't come home, and the official report didn't add up. Most of the names on it had answers now. One didn't. There was still a name on her list she hadn't found. A face from a surveillance photograph taken 18 months earlier on a rooftop outside Kandahar, half in shadow, never identified. A shape that could have been anyone, and it haunted her for exactly that reason. Someone had been there. Someone was still out there. Tomorrow would bring new ghosts to hunt, and she'd learned a long time ago not to mind that. The waiting never bothered her. It never had. Waiting was just another kind of stillness, and stillness was the one thing she'd always been good at. She folded the faded patch once, gently, and put it back in her breast pocket where it had ridden for years, closer to her heart than any rank insignia ever could have been. Then she stood, checked her watch one last time, and walked toward whatever came next. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to MVP Stories for more.